Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the impact of open government, assessing the evidence. When we were approached by the Open Government Partnership to undertake this survey of the scholarly literature on whether open government works or not, I had a remarkable experience of closing the circle. I had a flashback to the day in 2010 when Samantha Power, my White House colleague, then working in the National Security Council, and myself, then the special counsel and special assistant to the president for ethics and government reform, had a conversation in which she said to me, we need to do something to propagate the President Obama's ideas and to welcome all the world together to work on this stuff. And out of that conversation, and many, many others, in the White House with Cass Sunstein and Beth Novick and Jeremy Weinstein and many others, came the idea for the Open Government Partnership. So I was very excited when my OGP colleagues approached me now in my Brookings role to figure out if this thing that we had poured so much effort into in the Obama administration, our open government initiatives, and that so many of you have worked so hard on and that we all came together on in OGP, actually works. And 800 scholarly studies later, these are new glasses, 800 scholarly studies later, and after talking to dozens of people all over the world, and wonderful input for which I have to thank Aruna and Butch, we were able to say, yes, open government works. What a relief that must have been to OGP when I called them and said, yes, open government works, but there's some buts that go with that. And but number one, is that the evidence is incomplete. There are many gaps. The scholarship is evolving. We are not able to offer scholarly evidence for every form of open government. The field is moving more quickly than the research can manage. There's a research practitioner barrier that all of you are familiar with firsthand. So there's a lot of buts attached. We have come up with, and folks should have, either in its full bound form or in our handy-dandy one-page summary, and there's some more. Munima has some more down here if anyone needs one. We've come up with this report, and we have a neat chart that reflects the conditions under which we found open government works. The most robust measurement in the studies was for goals. Of course, when you ask if something works, the question is, what are the goals? And does it achieve those goals or objectives? And can you how rigorously can you demonstrate causation, correlation, or other satisfactory associations? So we measured for the three areas that we thought were most well established in the scholarship in our reading, and that was improved public services, broader and deeper participation, and the combination of reduced corruption and budgetary savings. We'll talk on the panel a little bit about the challenges in demonstrating the connection between reductions in corruption, which I very much believe are associated with open government, so we broadened a little bit to include budgetary savings. There are three criteria, and Munima, I want you to signal me when I need to pivot over to the panel. Okay, wave at me. Please, I'll keep glancing over at Munima. there are three principal criteria, and you have this in front of you. One, you must identify the principals. You need to know who. There's this principal agent theory with typically the citizens are the users of the open government program, the ultimate intended audience. You've got to very precisely figure out before you start who you're helping. Who are you trying to reach out to? Whose lives do you want to affect? And I will tell you, having been involved in all of the Obama administration's open government initiatives for the first 2 years when I served in the White House, and then when I moved to the State Department, I continued to be involved, including with OGP. And many of our initiatives were launched without regard to identification of the principals. It just didn't occur to me. Number two, ensure the information is important. You really need to think a lot, we found in the studies, about what matters to people, what is critical information. Of course, we want to have as much data open and online, as much information as possible, but there's such a thing as data overload, and it actually turns out that there are certain critical data sets, information buckets that matter the most to people. Number three, ensure the information is accessible and publicized. Too often we found, as we reviewed the studies, that there was good and valuable information and nobody knew it was out there, and particularly the end users and the end users who are most in need. And then there's three more criteria. You need to have at least one, more is better here, but at least one of these three criteria in order to have an open government program that works in these three areas. And by that I mean the studies demonstrate that when you have one of these three criteria, you're able to show the rigorous connection between the improved public services, participation, and reductions in corruption or budgetary savings. And they are, can the principals respond meaningfully as individuals? Are officials supportive of reform, or can the principals coordinate to change their agents' incentives? And we're going to focus a little more on the back half of the chart on these three criteria today. The point of them being that the information alone is not enough. The cutting edge of what we're trying to do in open government work really is the political side, where we're using the information, you have interaction between the stakeholders to drive change, to make a real difference in people's lives. So that was the structure that we came up with. I'm already putting it to work. I've been sharing the learnings of far and wide, and I'm very excited today to have our distinguished panel with us to talk about their experiences in a variety of settings with open government. So I'm going to, we have our great open government champion from India. I'll call on people and briefly introduce as we go down the panel. And Aruna Roy, I want to thank you very much for your help with our report. And I'm going to begin our panel by asking our panelists, what do you believe, in your experience and in your study of the area, is the single biggest obstacle that we need to overcome to make open government work in all the ways we've discussed and more? Aruna, may we begin with you?
I was hoping you'd begin with the positives, but nevertheless, the single biggest obstacle is the denial of power to share what it has. Because let's not forget it, right to information, as I see it, is asking for a share of power that democracy promises us when it gave us the vote. So the single biggest resistance comes from the system because it doesn't want to share that power by giving us transparency, disclosure, information, and it's increasingly bringing in new laws to restrict it from the other side. You get the right to information law, but you get on the other side other laws that restrict your right to freedom of expression, restricting your mobility, restricting so many other things. So I think the threats lie outside the law, the legal framework, but in the democratic system not wanting to share power. And I think if you want the principle, it's the denial of wanting to share power.
Lord Maude, Francis Maude, one of the great open government champions in the UK, in light of the resistance, do you agree that that is the obstacle? And why should, if so, if I may ask, you've embraced open government in your career. How have you dealt with that obstacle, and why should policymakers embrace open government in the face of that resistance that Aruna has described?
Okay, thanks. A couple of points to make first. First of all, just by chance this morning, I was on the telephone with, in Australia with Tim Kelsey, who was my Director of Transparency in the UK government at the time when we were with the US very involved in setting up the AGP. So he was very jealous that I was here at the AGP summit, and it looks forward. Actually, he's running now an important digital agency in Australia, actually getting involved in the AGP again. So he sends fraternal greetings to you all. I mean, your point on what are the obstacles, what's the resistance? There's no resistance that can't be overcome, but the essential positive condition for open government working or being driven through is a political will to do it, and a political will which is supported by civil society organizations. When I was the lead co-chair of the AGP back, I guess, 3 years ago, and I used to say to civil society organizations, if you are in a mode where you are kind of seeing the government as an antagonist, this isn't going to work. What you need to understand is that in every government, and this applies whether you're talking about politicians or officials, non-elected officials, there are reformers and there are resistors. And being a reformer, and I realized at the end of my political career, because I've now liberated myself, I was someone to whom any status quo is a living affront and needs to be challenged and changed. For being a reformer in government is quite a lonely business. You can quite often feel quite beleaguered. And what's important in this partnership that it needs to be for open government between civil society organizations representing in a way the people who are the people who need to have the power of information to share. You need to kind of support the reformers in their tasks and understand that governments are not monolithic. These are not sort of homogeneous organizations. They're very disparate, and the reformers need support. And even if you've got a head of government, as you had in President Obama, and I had in David Cameron, who are deeply committed to this and willing to do the thing which you go beyond the first 12 months. All oppositions, we know, favor transparency. It's a great idea. And then when they get into government, they favor it for the first 12 months because all they're doing is revealing what their predecessors have done. Beyond that, you get into real-time accountability, and it's out of the comfort zone. And that's the moment where the commitment of the political leadership shows.
Minister Scott Brison of Canada, you're a champion inside of government now for openness. I'll never forget, Francis, at the end of the first year in the White House, the president had signed a memo ordering all the agencies to comply with FOIA and to be forward-leaning on FOIA. And at the end of the first year, we got our FOIA statistics back. It was exactly the same as the last year of the Bush administration. So needless to say, there was a very unhappy chief of staff who called me into his office. The resistance is, now there were some improvements. It was not exactly the same, to be fair. So, Minister Brison, knowing of these challenges from inside government, tell us why do you and why should policymakers embrace open government?
Well, first of all, I agree with Francis in terms of the importance of support and political leadership at the very top. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is a reformer, as was Obama, has been a reformer, and your Prime Minister, David Cameron, was in terms of these areas. That's critically important, but our mandate letters as ministers, and I've served in 2 cabinets. One was in the last Liberal government in Canada 10 years ago, and now more recently after our re-election. And my mandate letter, when I was served previously, mandate letters were coveted and protected, and the minister and his or her deputy minister would have the mandate letters. Below that, any associate deputy or any director within the department might have an opportunity to see the paragraph that pertains to their work for 15 minutes, but that was about it. Our mandate letters, if you go to the Prime Minister of Canada's website, you can read the mandate letters for every minister, and you will see the commitments we've made to Canadians. And we're no longer just accountable to the Prime Minister, but we're accountable to citizens now as a result of that. So it makes a huge difference. Now, in terms of how that strengthens our work as policymakers, it's really important to, and our government now is actually engaged in 140 different consultations with Canadians on everything from climate change to democratic reform. And if you share the information with your citizens, and if you engage your citizens in important dialogue about the challenges you face, over a period of time, the policy options will emerge from those discussions, and they will emerge with a broader level of public support. And in the old days, you'd have a policy group in one room, and you'd have the communications group in the other room. And the communications people were there to help you sell the policy that was developed by the smart people in the policy room. And ultimately, I think that public engagement as part of sound evidence-based policy development will enable much broader public support for much better public policy.
All right, I already have to update my report based on the minister's description of what's going on in Canada and his portfolio.
See, I was going to read some of the mandate commitments, but I realize you all probably have already read them now just sitting here.
We found a similar thing when we put the White House visitor records online in the United States. That previous administrations, both Democratic and Republican, there's no party aspect to the love of secrecy, had litigated for years to keep a handful of these visitor records, who's coming and going to the White House. We put them virtually all online with very narrow national security exceptions. We may talk about that a little bit. Truly a tiny handful. There are millions there now. Speaking, though, as the minister did, of the connection with the principals, the people that we enter government to serve, all the citizens and all the different stakeholders. Contact with constituents is often most direct on the local level. We're very fortunate to have Mayor Kathie Tovo from one of my favorite American cities, Austin, to talk about how she engages with open government and to answer this question, why should policymakers embrace open government in light of all the challenges, Mayor?
Thank you. Actually, Mayor Pro Tem Kathie Tovo, I serve as the assistant mayor, and I'm really pleased to be here among you today. You know, I represent Austin, Texas, and some of you may have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the initiatives that we have within the Open Government Subnational Pilot Program throughout the course of the next several days. Austin, Texas is a city that has embraced open government for years. It is really embedded in the culture of Austin, Texas. It's a place where in 1992, citizens led a referendum that became a city ordinance to protect some of our most environmentally sensitive lands. We've had several other successful citizen initiatives, including one that really reformed our government from an at-large council system where every council member among the 7 were elected by the entire city to one that is geographically districted. And I've had the very interesting experience of serving both on the last at-large system as well as the district-based system. I'm the only council member actually who carried over from the old system to the new, which is another interesting facet of my job. But I think there are 2 main reasons that I see every day in my work why open government matters. One is it instills trust and confidence among our constituents that we have their best interests at heart, that we are balancing and really considering a multitude of perspectives before we make those decisions, and that those decisions are going on in the public forum. And then the second is that the decisions we make are far better when we're involved and we're creating those decisions and those programs and those projects in collaboration with our community. And I came from, I'll just very briefly describe my background. I was I was an instructor at the college level and headed on a different path, but I got involved with my community, with my neighborhood association, and started getting more involved in city issues and was more or less a neighborhood rabble-rouser, was down at city council, submitting my own public information requests, engaging with my council members, and trying to influence public policy as a community member. And in the course of that period, one of the things that came to light were some emails that our current council, or excuse me, our previous council was exchanging, including on the dais while the public was down providing testimony. And it became a matter of great public discussion. It became also quite controversial. There were a couple key issues that had been very controversial in the community, and the emails that were published in the newspaper really showed the pattern of discussion that was going on outside of meetings. And it was troubling to some members because they were down there advocating for certain positions to council members who were expressing very different perspectives in their emails. They were also, a couple council members had made disparaging comments about the public while they were down communicating. And in fact, it was one of the key reasons I ran for city council, because I saw some of those emails, including among the emails that the incumbent I ran against was writing, and I decided, we needed a different vision there on city council. I mentioned Austin is really embedded open government into its practices every day. We make a variety of materials available to the public, from our minutes to the transcripts of our meeting to our videos. We have an opportunity as council members to ask questions of our staff while we're making decisions on the agenda, and all of those become public. And so it's very, very common that members of the public will come forward and they will refer to them. They use that information not just to develop their own opinions, but to hold their elected council members accountable. It's not uncommon for somebody to stand before the podium and say, Councilmember Tovo, you said X when you were making this decision several months ago. We expect you to operate under the same values with regard to this. And I hope we have an opportunity at some point during the discussion to really talk about a couple of the initiatives that Austin citizens have helped drive, because most of the really exciting work that's going on in Austin with related to climate change work and clean energy and zero waste really are driven by the community. And I think that's the second very valuable reason to support open government initiatives. We create much better decisions when we're working in collaboration with our community members.
Okay, Secretary Abad, one of the great champions, both inside the government in the Philippines and a great and otherwise in civil society, and a great friend as we were working on the paper. So I'll ask you, Butch, you've now heard everybody talk about, I think there's a consensus. I would have been surprised if anybody on the panel had said, despite the pitfalls, we should not embrace open government. I think there's a consensus about that. Are you satisfied? It's a working draft, so I want everybody here and everybody who's watching to send us comments and questions and to tear the paper to shreds. It's too important to just put on a shelf. But do you think you were kind enough to read the first draft? And Butch sent us voluminous comments. He gets, Aruna also is the other reader on on the panel today, and both of them sent truly wonderful and voluminous comments. I was tempted to publish Butch's as a paper in itself or as a blog posting at Brookings. Butch, have we made the case in the paper? Does open government work? Is it worth embracing despite the pitfalls and the challenges?
Well, I think it's important to remind people that, as Francis stated, this is not easy work. Every time you speak of change or reform, there is always an instant pushback from those who are affected by it, or even those who are supposed to benefit from it, who are anxious about change. That's why I think in response to the first question, for me, of course, it depends on the context as well as the character of government that comes to power, but I think at the end of the day, what is crucial is we are able to restore people's trust in their government. In 2010, the Philippines was called the sick man of Asia. And I guess the reason is for a country that had so much potential and very skillful, qualified people, it wasn't. It was one of the poorest countries in the region. But in a matter of 6 years, we are now among the fastest growing countries in the world today. In a short period of time. And I think it wasn't, for the most part, economics that did it for us. It was a vigorous, unrelenting, anti-corruption and good governance campaign. President Aquino made sure to deliver to the people the message that I am serious. We are going to catch the big fish. So we prosecuted the president that we succeeded. We impeached and convicted a sitting Chief Justice. We impeached and forced the resignation of a national ombudsman. We prosecuted members of Congress, the House and the Senate, and many generals. And I think people, when they saw that, they got the message. And the president said, it is not enough that we show a will in prosecuting corruption. I think people should also feel that when you do that, it translates to real benefits by way of social protection, social services, and quality jobs and livelihood. And that's why the president said, we have to make sure that public financial management is also at the center of our reforms, because then that will allow us to make sure that we have the resources to be able to translate all of this into real benefits for our people. And I think by pursuing good governance reforms, by making sure that social protection, basic education, public health services are provided, and by growing the economy in a way that allows for jobs and employment to be generated, I think people will understand then that this government is serious about opening up to us. Because a government can open itself, but when its people are close to the openness of government, there's really nothing that you can do. And I think that's very key. That's why from the start up to the very end of his term, President Aquino was our most popular president.
So I think what we've heard from the panel is their experiences that open government is worth it, that open government works, and that open government can actually be a driver not just of achievement of sustainable development goals in a variety of ways, but actually can be helpful to those running government, the agents acting on behalf of their principals, the people, in delivering what they promised and succeeding in office. It has its challenges, but it's worthwhile. We're going to do a 10-minute speed round I'm going to limit everybody, and I've actually got a giant clock here, so I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to limit their interventions a little bit. I think if we do 90 seconds apiece, we'll be okay, because we're very eager to hear from all of you to open it up to the audience. So I'd like to focus everyone on the back half of the report, the 3 criteria. One, either the principals must be able to respond meaningfully as individuals, the citizens or other stakeholders. 2, you must have officials who are supportive of reform. Or 3, the ability of the principals to coordinate to change their agents' incentives. And if you read the report, which I hope everyone will do, and I have it up on the Brookings website if you don't have a full hard copy, with a cover blog, you'll see there's wonderful examples that we have drawn out from the literature of principals responding meaningfully as individuals to sometimes very simple things like publicizing regional vote tallies in Afghanistan so you can detect voter fraud. Officials who are supportive of reform in India or Uganda achieving remarkable successes in basic human needs like education or infant mortality by driving openness online, and principals coordinating to change their agents' incentives, parents coming together all over the world using school report cards to push for improved outcomes in that regard, and budgetary citizen monitoring of budgetary inputs that saves money and reduces corruption. So let me put it to the panel now. Do you agree? Are these the right 3 drivers that you must have? And can you give us a quick example from your own experience of a place where either the ability of the principals to respond meaningfully, supportive officials driving reform, or principals coordinating to change their agents' incentives, the people working together through open government initiatives to drive, make us government policymakers do better? I will strictly cut you off after 90 seconds. Aruna, shall we start with you?
I think it's a dialectic between the individual, the collective, and the government and power. And I think it never stops. And I just think that but this access to information and transparency has made political ideology take a backseat. It doesn't matter where you position yourself ideologically, but if you win, you have to be transparent. And that's what India has shown in the last 2.5 years, that whether it's the works program where they cut our budgets, when then they had to have a relook at the budgets and increase the budget, whether they made attempts to curb rights under the right to information, and they had to again withdraw because of popular support, or whether there has been a great positive impact on governance. But there has also been, as I said before, restrictive laws being brought in to curtail the right to dissent, the right to freedom of expression, and so on. And so it's a dialectic. You don't get everything, and you don't get nothing. But the place for engagement, I think the right to information, the OGP, and many other countries have established. That's why today, even here, we are together. And I think that's the principal achievement, that governance is now everybody's business.
Thank you, and perfectly timed. India's right to information law is one of the crown jewels of international open government. Okay, Francis, which of those 3, if any, you can disagree with them, and a personal experience where you've seen that or another program work specific?
Well, Aruna is completely right. The transparency is ideology neutral. You know, this is a principle which can be adopted, has been adopted by governments of every kind of political hue in every kind of system, and it has no ideological content at all. I mean, I was just going to make a quick point, which is that, I mean, it's great that your report has established that open government does work in terms of some objectives that get met. I wouldn't actually be that bothered if you hadn't proved that, because for me, open government is an inherent good. Governments are very likely to get better, even if you can't prove it. And so, I mean, for me, the conditions you've identified all seem very sensible. Is it essential that principals as individuals are able to respond and use the information to put pressure on the agents? And I do love the idea that governments, public service providers, then become the agents of the principals. This is turning government inside out. You know, everything we did on digitization when we created the Government Digital Service, led Britain to be top of the world rankings for digital government. Our mantra was always user need. Governments typically expect the public and businesses to adapt themselves to the form that government, however government happens to be configured by historical accident. Actually, government needs to reinvent itself around the needs of users, and the data that we provide through open government enables them to do that.
That digitization was fantastic, and just as Tim Kelsey says hello, Beth Novick says hello to everyone. I was on with her Yale Law students. We were all working on a project on open government together. I was on yesterday.
You're eating into my 90 seconds.
Minister, I see why you're such an effective member of the cabinet.
A couple of things. One, Butch mentioned the trust issue, and the fundamental point, and our Prime Minister repeats it, is how can we expect our citizens to trust government if government doesn't trust our citizens and provide them with some of the same information that we are using to make decisions. The questions on officials and officials supporting and being engaged in this and the importance of that, our experience in Canada is that at the officials level within our public service, there is a lot of support and buy-in for this. Public servants join the public service because they want to make a difference. And in closed systems for a long time, there has not been the ability for them to demonstrate results and to show results within their departments, across government, and to citizens. So putting in place, as we're doing, a results policy and a results framework for reportage where we have metrics and we have indicators that make sense to citizens, that reflect better services for Canadians and better value for taxpayers and more openness to citizens. This reportage, this openness, is actually good for the public service because it enables them to derive a sense of purpose and meaning in terms of their ability to drive change and make a difference on behalf of Canadians.
I agree that open government is a good in its own, but I believe this is a big debate that we need to have. I believe we're going to have to show that it achieves those as well.
Better
both
results.
a good in its own and better results. Unless we do both, we will fail. But we're off to a good start. Mayor Pro Tem, tell us, you wanted to give the examples. If you can share an example, particularly one that may relate to those three alternative essential criteria.
Sure, I'll talk. I think those three essential criteria are very reasonable, as has been said. And, you know, I think, too, though, as we talk about the importance of valuing citizen expertise and involving citizens in helping shape the work of government, I think it's really important to reflect back to the public how their input has mattered. And so I would say in Austin, we have several ways in which we solicit input. For example, on our budget, we have an online forum for people to contribute suggestions and ideas. We have an ability for citizens to take a budget in a box and then provide suggestions to the council through those ways. But we are continuing, and I'm continuing to think about how we actually reflect that work in our budgeting process and how we tell the public where their work shows up. One great example of where it's been very successful, we have 40 or so boards and commissions. These are volunteer boards. We have many members of the public who serve on them. And we have, over the last couple of years, really strengthened the connection so that people see who are serving on those boards and commissions how their work has actually influenced policy. And so we've done some intentional work in making sure that those recommendations first of all, come to the City Council, and that when the City Council brings forward a resolution, as an individual council member, I always try to say, you know, this was work that came from the boards and commissions. And I would say as policymakers, that's really critical, that we acknowledge the work of the community when it is really standing on the ideas and the issues that they've raised, because people need to see that their work matters, that they have agency in helping create the government. And I always cringe when I hear leaders, talk about their initiative. Very, very often it is really an initiative that came from the public and was shaped by the public. And so reminding the broader community of that work, I think, is very important.
Great, and if I dare, that's a wonderful example of criteria 6, and if I dare say so, your own political career being drawn in by those emails is also a great example. Okay, Butch, you've got your 90 seconds to take us home to the Q&A. They will throw us out of this room in 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
No, I think fundamentally it's important to clarify the roles, that the people are the principal and government is just their agent. Sometimes the roles are reversed, and even the people think that is the case. And when people speak about sustaining, institutionalizing openness, I think it's going to be a big mistake if all the investment is made in government. I think ultimately, if you want this to be embraced as a way of life, as a culture, I think the investments, for the most part, should be on the people.
Beautiful. And you yielded back some of your 90 seconds. I love you for that. And much else, Butch, much else. The great movement in human history, I believe, is the one you've described, from the people as the agents to the people as the principals. Okay, with that, we throw it open to questions. The more controversial, the better. Shall I just take them at random? Yes. Please identify yourself and tell us your question. Is somebody bringing you a microphone, or shall I toss this one into the audience?
Hi there. I'm Megan Campbell. I'm with Feedback Labs. And my question is, at the end of this report, it notes that there are still really crucial gaps in the evidence for whether open government makes a difference. And I think it's important for us to remember that all of us within this room are pretty convinced by open government, and there are a lot of people who aren't. So my question for the panel is, when you think of the skeptics that you've encountered, so maybe your colleagues, people in other government, the ones who still have yet to be convinced, I'm curious what evidence you think is most needed to make the case for them in a really tangible way. What's the agenda to be able to say, this is what we need to prove if we're going to win over people who aren't already in the choir?
Okay.
Francis?
I mean, for me, it's that this is a point that Butch made at the outset, that openness builds trust. And we had a great example of this. We introduced a major projects authority with oversight of all of the government's big projects, £400 billion worth of projects. And we introduced a uniform system of ranking them and assurance and oversight. And then we published those rankings, traffic light rankings, red, amber, green. Huge anxiety in governments once they realized what they'd agreed to, which was happily later. So what they thought was, well, we got this project, which is kind of ex-minister's pet sort of project, and it's red rated. How's that going to go down? Well, the answer is, yes, you have first time we did it, minor controversy, a few media stories. Next year, we did it the same way, and we were very open about saying, this thing has got better, this thing hasn't improved, new things come on that aren't going so well. But actually, it became routine, it becomes routine, and it builds trust. Another occasion where I had a big review done of commercial capability across government, because we'd had some things go badly wrong. It was pretty damning of the commercial capability. And we published it. There were attempts made, I have to say, by some senior civil servants to water it down and dilute it. I insisted we published it. And I will remember when the BBC interviewer came to talk to me about it. And I remember how when he looked at it, his face fell. He said, well, no one's going to accuse you of a whitewash, of a cover-up. And it builds trust. If governments show that they're willing to volunteer information that is not good news, then without it being dragged out in the way that is conventional, then just possibly people start to believe you when you talk about things that are going well.
So,
Okay, yes. Is that a follow-up to that or a separate
it is
question?
a follow-up. in a
Okay,
way.
yes. Identify yourself for us,
Certainly.
please.
Alex Howard from the Sunlight Foundation.
One of my Twitter followers. I encourage all of you to do as Alex does and follow me at Norm Eisen. You'll be entertained, if nothing else. Go ahead, Alex.
I hope to become more than that. My question is provocative in the way I think that perhaps you asked for. I would say first this. You say that transparency is not ideological. I would disagree. Authoritarians and fascists hate it. And those are ideologies. Perhaps in democracies, it's not ideological if people of good faith agree. But there's more than one system of government. And I think this conference has rightly focused upon the issue of democracy being in retreat. Our democracy is in something of a transition right now, which is occupying a great deal of attention on our side of the Atlantic. So here's the question. We had a candidate who was made the most transparent in modern history by a combination of FOIA lawsuits, journalist investigations, the FBI, and hackers going into personal accounts and
I'm not sure who you're talking
parties.
about.
That would be former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who's made to be the most transparent. And we had a candidate who was the least transparent in modern history. And yet, paradoxically, the public believed the man who was the least transparent and was the most distrustful of the candidate who was the most. How do you account for this phenomenon, and what does it tell us about transparency in the age of the internet?
Aruna wants to answer. I can't permit the question to be directed at Minister Brison unless we create an international incident. But Aruna has a quick answer, and then perhaps the
Well, I'll just take my 30 seconds. I think what Francis said was, it started with me, so I just want to say that I did not mean that. I meant that no matter what the ideology of an elected democratic government, whether it is or not for transparency, when there's a vibrant transparency campaign, as there is in India, they have to be transparent as much as they can. And if they want to destroy the architecture of transparency, they find it very difficult because of people's participation. But I do agree that you need a basic democratic framework, you need institutional support, you need systems, and you need a law. Without that, you cannot be transparent, but it restricts the potential of every individual who comes to power to be despotic, to be a potential dictator, and I think these things are apparent in the Indian system. We can have a look and see the plus and minus of both.
I think the earlier question, and how do you prove this works? You can't manage what you don't measure, and you've got to show results to people. And you know, we follow very closely in Canada, performance.gov, and the Obama administration did that. We're going to do a results.gc.ca, again, putting those indicators out there so that people can, in terms of the services that define government for a lot of people, making them better services makes a huge difference. In terms of the US political situation or Brexit, in the vote in the UK, a lot of these things, or even you could say the rise of Bernie Sanders during the primaries, there's a lot of people in our democracies, participants in our economy, who don't think they're doing very well. We've got to do more to help those people share in the economic wealth of our countries, and that's going to be really important.
All right, they're cutting us off. Look, we have to leave the room, right? I and as many of the panelists as can manage will stay outside to continue talking and answer questions. Please look at the report. Please send comments to me or to OGP. I'm on the Brookings website. Truly, we want your insights. I thank you for a very, very